to waste any more time, we'll get down to business. Our first speaker is Andy Hinds. Andy has worked in theatre all his life in many capacities. He's worked as a director, an acting teacher, a playwright, an author, and a translator. So Andy, over to you.
Hi folks, I'd like to read a paper I've written, which I hope will begin to open a conversation about what I feel is underlying a lot of the things that people have talked about today. For example, the attack on free speech and the resistance to allowing men's issues into the national cause of conversation. In 1984, Michelle Elliott founded Kidscape to, quote, help children stay safe from sexual abuse and from bullying. In 2008, she was awarded an OBE for services to children, and the following year was named the UK's Children and Young People's Champion. In the early 90s, she produced a book called The Female Abuse of Children, a book of essays about female paedophiles. Through the work with her own charity, Elliott estimates that around 25% of paedophiles are female. As a result of raising this taboo subject, she was subjected to, in her own words, a deluge of hate mail from feminists. I was vilified, I was cast out of the sisterhood, I was no longer a good feminist. And when she organised a conference on the issue, 400 people attended, including between 20 and 30 women. She says, who dotted themselves in the audience, stood up and attempted to stop proceedings, proceeded to shout and disrupt, saying that the conference was trying to take attention away from male paedophiles and the victims. In Elliott's words, to these women, sexual abuse had to be under the guise of male power. Any facts or ideas that presented the slightest challenge to this false narrative, that only women and children can be the victims of sexual abuse, that it is exclusively men who are perpetrators, that it is anti-women, misogynistic, anti-feminist who question this, had to be stamped out. And the people daring to present such facts and ideas had to be silenced. The determination with which these protesters needed to cling to and protect such a partial view of reality, I found chilling. As a result of raising the subject, Elliott tells us, I was vilified, I was cast out. The justification these protesters offered for their attempts to shut down the conference was that it was out of a genuine concern about the safety and protection of little children. Had I been there, my response would have to have been, I don't believe you. I'd have to say, I think something else is going on. If your priority were the protection of children, you would be passionately keen to listen to the facts and experiences Elliott and others were presenting. Take this clip up. More important than protecting children from abuse is your need to protect from any questioning your partial view of reality, even if it means, as it does, leaving many children unprotected from female paedophiles. If these women had anything to do about it, she says, Elliott that is, no one would have heard the information. Even though figures from other bodies corroborate Elliott's findings and experiences, some others put the figure at around 20%. How much awareness of this phenomenon is there yet in our society 25 years later? How many procedures are in place to protect children from such abuse as a result of this information being available? Even with this information being so available, British MP Andrea Leadsom is quoted as saying that men should not be hired to do childcare because they may be paedophiles. This, even though, as Elliott tells us, it is known that in order to have easy access to children, female abusers go into jobs such as teaching, childcare and nursing. Figures for 2009 in the UK reveal that only 2% of those on the sex offender register are female. And in 2016, females still represented only 2.2% of cases reported to the police. But the reason I refer to this incident is that to me it stands as a particularly graphic example of what 25 years later is happening more and more frequently. Worldwide and increasingly in Ireland, such aggressive suppression of any information notions or propositions even slightly or potentially inimical to certain current equally partial views of politically correct reality, these are now acceptable. Such suppression is applauded. Exactly why this is so has fascinated me. Why those protesters then and now are so desperate to keep certain facts, trends and realities redacted from the public conversation. Over a year ago, I attended as an observer when a few members of Men's Voices gave a presentation to a number of TDs and senators in Leinster House. It wasn't long before it became obvious that the female representatives who all gathered at the front had not come to listen to the group's outlining of issues affecting men and boys, and of which it was thought national representatives would be keen to hear about and address. Issues such as boys failing in education, the high rate of male suicide, and the injustices constantly visited upon fathers in the family courts. From the first speaker's opening words and throughout, I observed the women exchanging with one another looks indicating, "Can you believe this? Just wait till they stop and we can slap them back into the closet." When the speakers did finish, demobilized, one sprang to her feet. They were determined to challenge and gainsay everything that had been said, to undermine the possibility that men or boys could have any issues worthy of their consideration. One woman asked, why when lobbying for men's issues in this way did the speakers have to be so against women? As an observer, I can verify that women or their rights or anything else about them had not been mentioned in any of the presentations. The men were there to talk about men. In an attempt to minimize the stark realities of male suicide, another challenged, wholly wrongly, a single one of the very many unsettling male suicide statistics that had been presented. The difference between the hostile behaviour of the protesters at the Elliott conference and the behaviour of most of the women at that Oireachtas presentation, I regard to be only a matter of degree. Interesting footnote, all the male representatives that attended sat quietly at the back and didn't say a word. Perhaps they knew what was good for them. Minister with Special Responsibility for Third Level Education, Mary Mitchell O'Connor, recently announced, quote, the establishment of a task force, one of whose central objectives will be to examine the potential implementation of gender quotas across all areas of the sector. The espoused justification for this is her concern for gender equality across all areas of the sector. As with the Elliott protesters, I don't believe this. We have a gender problem in the sector, the Minister tells us. The system is flawed if the female perspective is missing at all levels. Men's Voices wrote a detailed open letter to Mitchell O'Connor listing the numerous areas in education where females predominate, sometimes overwhelmingly, and asking why she has expressed no concern about the lack of male perspective in these areas. She didn't respond. As with the Elliott women, facts inconvenient to a highly cherry-picked agenda are to be ignored. If gender equality were genuinely the Minister's concern, she would include it in the brief of her task force, examining why 53% of women aged 25 to 34 have a third level qualification, whereas only 39% of men in this bracket do, a 14% difference. She would examine why the ever-increasing gap between the numbers of males and females attending our universities currently stands at 55% female to 45% male. If such figures were the other way around, it would be regarded as a national crisis. She would be concerned about the gender gap existing in the majority of third-level subjects. It is constantly lamented that men are a majority in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And there are a number of well-funded initiatives in place whose brief is to, inverted commas, correct this situation. Never lamented is the reality that it is women who dominate, sometimes overwhelmingly, in the majority of university subjects, not only in the arts and humanities, but also in such sensitive areas as law, education, medicine, and the social sciences. And as this is where the problems leading to boys not making it to university begin, she would be concerned that according to the 2010 figures, the dropout rate for girls at secondary level was 8.4%, while for boys it was 12.6%, a 50% higher rate for boys dropping out than girls. She would be concerned that at primary level, 85% of teachers are female, and at secondary level, the percentage of male teachers has fallen steadily from 40% in 2003 to 31% in 2012, meaning that in their formative years, boys have few male role models to help them forward their sense of identity. Just as the suppression of facts to preserve a false view of reality by the Elliot protesters was going to leave many children without protection, so the exclusion of facts and trends from the version of reality that the minister is presenting to the people leaves issues concerning boys and men without fair and equal consideration. This is Misandry. Last year, Justice and Equality Minister at the time, Frances Fitzgerald, talked of her determination that Ireland should ratify the Istanbul Convention, averring that it was gender neutral. The reality is it explicitly privileges women and discriminates against men. Its full title is the Convention on Combating and Preventing Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. That her determination to have the Convention ratified is founded on equal regard for all victims of domestic abuse, domestic violence, both male and female. I do not believe that this is the basis of her determination to pass it. Men's Voices wrote an open letter to Fitzgerald, drawing detailed attention to the many articles in the Convention explicitly affording second-class citizens, second-class status to male domestic violence victims. We got a reply which unembarrassedly made no reference whatever to even one of the discriminatory articles we drew her attention to. And in an 8-minute radio interview I heard with the minister about the Convention, she got out of the way in the first few seconds that the Convention was gender neutral. Then she and the presenter went straight on exclusively to lament the plight of female victims, discussed exclusively the necessity for further resources and protections to be put in place for women. Male victims, their dilemma and protection, how they have been largely ignored, were not referred to by the minister or the interview even once. If the minister's concern was equally to protect and honour all domestic violence victims, she would have wanted to draw attention to the reality that whereas 1 in 3 female victims already report, only 1 in 20 males report. She would have made sure to highlight the fact that significant sums of public money are already devoted to providing resources and facilities for women, but negligible amounts for men, and would therefore be calling for extra funding and resources to be awarded to help encourage the 95% of male victims who do not report to come forward, and to provide resources for them when they do. Not to do so is misandrist. One of the number of occasions when I have faced that same hostile energy animating those at the Elliot event was in the course of a meeting I had with 2 senators, both female, one now a TD. They were both delighted to discuss with me the matters concerning the current state of gender equality in Ireland that I had arranged to talk to them about. Until, that is, I mentioned that it was the state of equality concerning men that was the focus of my research. In an almost cartoon way, their faces immediately changed, as in their eyes I could see I had transformed into an enemy. I told them about a report that had just come out saying that in 1 year alone, self-harm among young boys had increased by over 40%, and suggested that if this statistic had come out concerning young girls, that there would be a much greater hue and cry about it. No, there wouldn't, was the snapped reply. With any issue I raised, the reaction was similar. It was summarily rejected. No latitude was to be ceded to issues of equality or anything else that wasn't exclusively to do with girls or women. I remember thinking, last time I encountered such prejudice and resistance to listening was in the late 70s when I tried to reason with 2 of Paisley's Save Ulster from Sodomy campaigners. In the course of another meeting I had in the Oireachtas, this time with a young gay representative from one of the major parties, he asked how on earth I could have gone from founding Ireland's first gay rights organisation to today advocating for men. He was aghast at this, to him, inexplicable and dangerous defection. And when I began to explain what I perceived as some of the issues to do with men and boys, he lowered his eyes and he started texting. No matter what I might have said to that young man, he was determined not to take any accountability. His mind was shut tight. Having played his texting tactic one more time, he abruptly cut the meeting short and left, not an inch. And a few last quick examples of this determination to keep men's concerns well in the darkness of the closet. Following the announcement of our conference, 3 full-length articles appeared that most respectfully may be classed as overwrought denouncements of the event. Our writer managed to fill a full page in the magazine of the Sunday Business Post attacking the conference, not on the basis of the content of the conference programme, she had no information about that, but purely on the basis of her own prejudiced preconceptions, on the basis of what she, quote, felt it would, quote, probably be about. She states the conference, quote, feels like a gendered attack on women and women's rights. Extraordinary. The other two articles appeared in the online magazines Her, i.e. and headstuff.org. And again, as the writers had no facts whatever about the conference, the open hostility in the articles was grounded again entirely in the writers' projections of their own bias. Many sentences therefore had sneering openings such as, other expected highlights may include, or attendees will be hoping. These articles I regard as misandrist. If such pieces had been published mocking and condemning a women's event, they would be unambiguously condemned as misogynist. The question that again came most into my head when reading these pieces, apart from that of wondering how such evidence-free snarkiness can pass today as journalism, is why? What is at the root of this intransigent unwillingness to hear? These writers and those people we have met or wrote to that I referred to earlier, why do they feel so threatened by the notion of listening to men? By the idea of widening the equality conversation to include us? Again, I'm afraid I do not believe it emerges from concern for equality and parity of esteem for all citizens. One would imagine it could go without saying that to propose due concern be given to boys and men does not in any way, One would imagine it could go without saying that to propose due concern be given to boys and men does not in any way, as so many try to make us believe, represent a cover for demoting or challenging the genuineness of any real concerns women have and wish to have addressed. It is not a competition. Men's voices do not at all see it in that way. It would make no sense to do so. We see our and every nation's challenge as working together to ensure that as many of our country's citizens as possible feel their rights and concerns are being equally listened to, respected and addressed. To make the house as warm for one gender as the other. It feels like insulting a listener's intelligence to point out that true gender equality will never be placed on a lasting and level foundation, if only the perspective of one gender has representation at the table. As one of our group pointed out in the course of a recent discussion, that would be the equivalent of attempting to achieve and maintain the Northern Irish peace process by allowing the interests and perspectives of only one side of the community a voice. The concerns of all parties must obviously be heard and taken into account in the endeavour towards equality, must be made an equal part of any solution or outcome. Having described these encounters in articles, etc., it is important that I point out that over the course of the last 2 years, either on my own initiative or as a member of Men's Voices, I have had one-to-one meetings with well over 20 TDs and senators, putting to them the simple notion of including men's concerns on the national agenda. I am glad to report that a large majority of these, both male and female, listened with openness and understanding. Many of these also, however, spoke of the need to tread carefully, to use careful language, so fearful were they of the hostility and resistance inevitably faced by anyone trying to open the door to the male perspective. And in spite of all their agreement and goodwill, nothing has changed. The issues they all agreed were deserving of a hearing still remain largely unheard. I understood these representatives' apprehension about speaking out. A couple of journalists have admitted to us that they also self-censor on these issues. Certain groups, factions and individuals have managed to take exclusive hold of the public megaphone and without a fight to the death are not going to share it so other voices may be heard. And entertaining if it weren't so dangerous. This authoritarian censoring is carried out under the banner of the KKK, as for short I sometimes call it. Carried out under the banner of caring, compassion, and concern. We have ways of making you care. By way of opening the serious conversation that needs to be had about what underlies and what is driving this resistance to sharing the mic, I offer an opening generalization. I believe that for an increasing number of people, this has become a form of collective neurosis. It exhibits all the characteristics of a few classic and closely connected psychological syndromes, coping mechanisms usually discussed in terms of the psychological dynamic at work within an individual, but which I believe are currently being manifested, acted out on a collective societal level. There is a very good reason why these syndromes have become the coping mechanism of choice. They appear to offer enticing benefits. But as with any dysfunctional coping syndrome, however, the benefits are temporary and in the long term extremely harmful, both for the person manifesting the syndrome and those in any form of relationship with such persons. Many here will be familiar with the common and connected syndromes I am referring to. They are projection and victim mentality. As I quickly talk these through, I will leave it to all here present to ponder and honestly ask themselves to what extent they can see that these mechanisms may fairly be considered to play an active part in what is driving this type of censoring action and rhetoric I have been referring to. Projection is that most common mechanism whereby a person perceives as existing in the outside world some or all of the feelings, desires, drives, etc., that in reality reside within themselves. Feelings and desires they wish to disown, to take no responsibility for, and which they have therefore suppressed into unconsciousness. If a person is filled with, say, some ancient suppressed rage, but can't face owning the fact, can't face owning that in and of himself he is such a dark person, he may create a reason to be angry by seeing good cause for this rage in another person. Instead of thinking, I am full of anger, he thinks, you are making me angry. You are the cause. Alternatively, he may see the targeted person as being full of anger against himself. Such a one sees their own rage as embodied in the targeted person. The delusion is that now projected, this disowned rage or other feelings such as woundedness, etc., are happily not part of oneself anymore. They are out there, and they can potentially now be got rid of, can forever be changed, controlled, or destroyed by changing, controlling, or destroying the targeted individual person who is seen as embodying them. A classic example of this is the queer basher, who, by attempting to destroy the queer, is trying to destroy the homosexual desires he despises and has suppressed within himself. As well as wishing to suppress aspects of oneself considered to be negative, such as fear, sexual desire, the desire to hurt and punish, one can wish to disown aspects usually thought to be positive, such as self-esteem, the desire to care for and to nurture oneself, the drive to thrive, succeed, create and achieve, etc. No upbringing is perfect. This would be inhuman. While growing up, therefore, most all of us have either occasionally or more damagingly, constantly, been made to feel ashamed of these positive needs and desires, to feel that somehow they are wrong, and that we would be better, more lovable people without them. If the shame has been severe and consistent, the child, in order to survive, will suppress these feelings, together with the shame associated with them. As with the zone of negative feelings, to the extent a person has suppressed such positive feelings, they will tend to project them onto a targeted person. Such a one now experiences the targeted person as the container, the source of this respect, unconditional love, attention, nurturing, etc., that they cannot countenance given to themselves. The target now owes this unconditional love, the selfless, parental-like nurturing and attention to the person projecting. It is not only that the target is imagined as having the capacity to give these things to them, it is their job, it is their responsibility to give it to them. I'm going to have to finish. The target becomes dehumanized, existing as an object whose purpose primarily is to supply one with what in reality one can only ever give oneself. But of course the targeted person can never give enough, and the disappointment being deep, the projector will strive more and more desperately to get what they feel they need and are rightfully owed from that person. In reaction, I'll have to read this and it won't make any sense. But of course the targeted person can never give enough, and the disappointment being deep, the projector will strive more and more desperately to get what they feel they need and are rightfully owed from that person, will often go to hate and emotionally or physically abuse the targeted person. We put them in the pillory of public disapproval to expose to the world how sorely this person has betrayed and let them down. So doing, they are projecting their own disowned shame. Persons heavily invested in projecting the disowned parts of themselves in this way are manifesting classic clinical victim mentality. They are, as I sometimes term them, victim impersonators. One of the things that persons heavily invested in victim mentality most fears that they cannot tolerate is for their victimhood to be challenged, for them to be challenged to begin withdrawing and taking responsibility for their projections. It is akin to threatening to take away an addict's supply, and indeed the syndrome we are talking about has a lot of the hallmarks of addiction. The terror of withdrawal for the projecting person is that the scenario being played out of me blameless victim, you perpetrator, will be exposed for what it is, a performed and self-serving coping mechanism with no basis in reality. To those who have created an identity around their perceived victimhood, as more and more do today, exposure is existentially threatening. Too unthinkable is it to have to look down into the darkness of one's own being and see there all the disowned and despised desires, drives, self-loathing, etc. One has possibly spent a lot of one's life and one's life energy keeping out of sight. Near impossible to think of embarking on the process of owning them and integrating them into one's being. To say, as Prospero does of the monster Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest, this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. Check that. As one individual may project onto another in this way, the way I've described, and have myself experience. It is also challenging to have to start taking responsibility for one's having so used and objectified the targeted person, for having dehumanized and abused them perhaps over half a lifetime. To do these things, however, is the only way towards any form of psychological health and wholeness. I know how difficult this process can be. I have been in long-term relationships where I have played the role of the targeted person, and in another where for a long time I played a blinder as the victim impersonator. In the latter case, it was only when the distress, confusion and pain of the role I was playing became so overwhelming that I sought help and came to understand that my distress was almost all to do with me and little to do with the other. So that I had to embark on the steps of reclaiming and taking ownership and responsibility for something more resembling my real self. As one individual may project onto another in this way, in the way I've described, and have myself experienced, so within any society there will often operate particular groups who perceive themselves as a group to be the victims of another group within the society. Such a group feels and behaves very much as does a solo victim impersonator. Collectively, they similarly tend to project onto the target group the positive and or negative drives and feelings they feel unable to acknowledge as being part of themselves. As a queer to the aforementioned queer basher, the target group is experienced as representing a danger to the projecting group, often as toxic. And the victim group imagine that the job and responsibility of the target group is to restore to them all the things they tell themselves the target group and all their privilege have taken and continue to withhold from them. The apparent benefits for members of collective victim groups can seem just as seductive, if not more seductive, as the benefits for solo victim role play. As a member of a victim group, I gained for myself the high moral status currently awarded to members of, or virtuous champions of, whichever our society's privileged victim groups, LGBT, Native Americans, transgender people, etc. Women as a group are currently so favoured. A quote from a paper in the Journal of Couple Therapy. The victim stance is a powerful one. The victim is always morally right, neither responsible nor accountable, and forever entitled to sympathy. And the appetite of a victim collective is voracious. It must ever seek and denounce new areas of oppression and discrimination. And should these run out and no more to be found, as will a solo victim, they will simply invent them. For example, I can skip that actually. Yeah. And a final boon of both individual and collective victimhood is that under the mantle of the KKK, I get permission to indulge the darker side of my human nature, receive praise and shows of comrade-in-arms solidarity for judging, criticizing, for hating the oppressive perpetrator or group. The more I am seen to express my hate and disapproval of those designated as the oppressor, the more loving I can claim to be. In a perfectly Orwellian manner, hate is love. Also, if all goes well, I will have the pleasure of taking part, or of at least getting to look on, as the latest representative of the oppressor group is mercilessly shamed and stoned in a public place, until they are either completely silenced and destroyed, or are beaten into the shape all right-thinking people know they ought to have. I'll wrap it now. This is the conclusion. The next question is how to get beyond this. How to stop the ever deeper divisions being created in our society by the tides of victim rhetoric and behaviour sweeping across the world. This is the difficult series of conversations that desperately now needs to be had. In the end, a large part of the solution unavoidably comes down somehow to facilitating ourselves and others to look with honesty into ourselves and to take full responsibility for what we find, to stop telling ourselves it's not me, it's him, her, or them, to wean ourselves from the addiction to blaming. As Eastern philosophy tells us, blame is a lack of self-knowledge. And as Nelson Mandela told us, if you want to bring about change, you have to start by changing yourself. Committed feminist Cassie J set out to make a film documentary which would expose to the world what she was convinced was the entrenched misogyny of the men's rights movement. With great honesty, in a recent TED Talk, she confesses to her audience that for a long time when making the film, quote, I would hear an innocent and valid point being made by a men's rights activist, but in my head, I would add on to the statement a sexist or anti-woman spin, assuming that was what they really wanted to say, but didn't. She explained that it was only when she was transcribing the recordings of her conversations with these men, word by word, that she realized the reasonableness of what they had said. Only then did she understand the extent to which she had not been listening. The extent to which she had only heard what she wanted to hear. As with the women at the Elliott Conference, she had been projecting from a victim mentality. From that moment onward, she started truly to be able to hear and to listen. If confirmed feminist Cassie J can get to that point, and without consciously trying, then surely somehow, if we set out to develop our awareness and a willingness, the rest of us can too. Only when we embark on this process can we begin to experience ourselves and others as separate, different, and of equal value to us, see them as fully human, and thereby begin to be able really to see, to hear the voice, and listen to the point of view of those not ourselves. Then men and women can sit at the same table, together, talk to each other without blame, projection, or preconception, hear one another's voices. My hope is that this conference will make some small contribution towards allowing this to happen. Thank you.